Next is John Stoughton from Team B Architects in Cincinnati. He's going to join.
Oh, can you join me? Okay.
I think. Well,
Not off the clock, so.
we're gonna. You don't have to stay, but it'd be nice if you could.
Okay.
If you could help out a little bit.
So I'm gonna help.
Yeah, you should help.
Okay, right.
Because John has done a lot of work on. Or John and I together did some work on B-sides here.
Okay.
Sort of digging up the other stuff that's not part of the major,
Right.
kind of narrative. And you and I have also had some good conversations about that there's multiple strands to it. So I was going to ask John, like, we came here and looked at Koha, which was the famous Hugh Hardy building that has recently kind of come under threat. And then that's the interior, and Mount Healthy School, also H3, Hugh Hardy, and then John Johansson Smith Elementary, which is just really cool. If anyone from out of town hasn't seen these, they would be good ones to check out. But also we looked a bit at the Holiday Inn. The Holiday Inn is really an underrated piece of architecture in this town. It's a holodome with like a Victorian town around the pool that you can, so all the rooms look out onto this pool. And then also of course the mall, the dead mall, Fair Oaks Mall. And then that's the inside of the holodome. So some of these kind of minor architectures, I guess, I think are important for telling the story of Columbus. So I guess what's your takeaway from coming here? What's your experience with coming here and looking at these?
Yeah, so I guess first off, just to take a step back, I'm based out of Cincinnati, so I'm a practicing architect in Cincinnati. And so I get over here maybe once a year at the most. And I usually look at the city less academically than Enrique and more observationally.
Mine's
So-
only marginally academic.
Well, I think the interesting thing about coming back here over the course of multiple years is you have time to let these buildings kind of marinate a little bit and sit with you. One of the first questions I asked when I got here after coming on a school trip, as a tourist really, is where does the tour bus not go? What are the buildings that are here but are just kind of lurking in the background, so to speak? And the game that Matt and I started to play was we could start to classify those buildings as maybe the A sides, or the buildings that are published, and the B sides were maybe more compelling to us in that maybe they presented another take or a dialogue with other buildings that was maybe more of a complete story to the city. So I think that's kind of the framework of how I view the city. And like you mentioned, Smith Elementary, the Johansson building, it's the one with there's more individual clusters of classrooms. They're kind of scattered. They're connected by these really fascinating tunnels, all colorful kind of tunnels. That was built the same year that Southside was built. I don't know if you have a photo of that one, but that's more of a kind of austere, brutalist building. So you can kind of cast those against each other, and they start to form a really interesting dialogue with each other. I'm not sure if there's anything you could elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, first of all, just this building. So I did some research on this publication out of the Yale School of Architecture called Nova Morgana, named after the Francis Bacon book. It was 68, 69. It was done in celebration of Klaus Oldenburg's Lipstick Ascending. That was what they did is they did these really interesting collages where they took all the building project houses and collaged hamsters on them, basically. So it's these are basically, it's hamster urbanism. It's that's total hamster urbanism right there. But the thing is, going back to the issue, the B side, it's we're using the language of dead media. I mean, I have a former student in the audience who probably doesn't know what a B side is, because you probably, when I say do you remember 45s? It's you think I'm a time traveler or something. That's kind of speaking the language of of like, you know, the 20th century, which seems like so far ago, but it's not so far ago to me. So, but like the B-side, it's like, you know, when bands, when artists like produce B-sides, it's basically, it's kind of like the record label saying like, it's like, you should put this on your B-side because it's not that cool, it doesn't fit with the rest of the album, but it's like, people might like it, you know, it's like no cognizance of like, you know, whether it's gonna become a collector's item or anything like that, so as a historian, it was like, it's like, I guess like my question would be like, what's the 78 RPM like of like architecture and you know, in Columbus, I guess it's like, you know, the old civic buildings perhaps and stuff, but the thing is like, you know, with the B-side, so maybe the way to start thinking about, you know, B-sides is not so much the things that you don't know, but like, what are the things that you should know? so it's like, or what are the things that, like, what are the reasons why you know, why is the Holodome, for example, like, I wouldn't say it's vilified. Like, I think Sam Jacob has written about the Holodome, for example. So, as a person who basically spent his youth, like, traveling in cars and, like, you know, road trips with his parents, it's like, we stayed in plenty of Holodomes. Those are a very huge part of my childhood, so. But it's like, so why is this stuff, you know, when you take, like, when you kind of strip away all the baggage of the discipline, you know, it's like, you know, the formal characteristics and stuff, it's like, why is it a B-side? Why is this something that you kind of like sneak in on design by inserting a person here? It's like, why is that?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing maybe related to the exhibit Columbus, maybe this is something exhibit Columbus maybe will start to bring up, is that I think we heard Jonathan actually earlier talking mostly about community, and everybody today I guess has kind of talked about community. And there's probably an awareness here of architecture that has infiltrated or like trickled down, for lack of a better term, to like minor commercial architectures. That there is this kind of depth or Mr. Pulley was talking about just environmental awareness and how that's maybe richer in certain places than others, and I think maybe that is kind of what Columbus has imparted on people. And maybe that's like, we could have showed up a bunch more commercial buildings. Yeah. And I don't know if that's maybe something that relates to the exhibit Columbus in that it's not just that those buildings have radiated out away from themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think the perfect segue to that is the mall, the Fair Oaks Mall, and its relationship with the Susan Pelly Commons Mall. There's like two different mall, maybe typologies, so to speak. You know, like a public space in the middle of the city versus something that's more of a satellite location, and just understanding how the maybe migration of one form to the other, and then maybe now back again is kind of intriguing to see. But also architecturally, I don't know, you'd probably speak more to if you could really even compare those two architecturally, other than the fact that, you know, they're two different types of space. One is more commercial, one is more public.
Definitely, and yeah, it definitely kind of relates, and I think maybe later we can talk about, I think it's probably what some people will talk about, but yeah. The arc of Columbus sort of follows every other city in a fascinating way, and it's kind of really clear here that the Commons was built in 1968, which is exactly the year you would expect like a really radical public space to be built, and it was a public indoor space. But it was very of its time, and then it, you know, the Fair Oaks is very much of its time too, and so you can sort of trace the trends not only in Columbus but across urban design or across architecture, through, or not even urban design, but just like the forces of urban design.
Can I say something about that? So, you know, you're talking about, you know, talking about the mall, and is the mall atypical or is the mall typical? So something to understand about malls. Malls are part of this kind of lineage of like architectural interventions that were first and foremost urban. You can trace the history of the mall, you know, not only the agoras, for example, but for example the 19th century galleries, you know, the arcades, for example, in Italy and France, you know, And the thing is, like, you know, when Victor Gruen was like designing, you know, malls in the Midwest, it was like he and his, you know, his unrealized plan for Fort Worth, for example, which is basically thinking of Fort Worth as a giant mall, an outdoor mall. It's like thinking of, you know, this kind of like elision between the commercial and the urban. Like the mall was always kind of understood as kind of like an urban space, like a new kind of urban space. You know, one where the thrills and vicissitudes of, like, you know, the impulse purchase is going to kind of like become like a substitute for your experiencing of the urban, you know, the urban realm as well. So in many ways, you know, I wonder if, like, you know, if the mall was kind of like an indicator for urbanism for places that we don't consider as urban, right? Like the mall becomes a marker for urbanity. So it's like we think of it as a, you know, the mall. If you watch Fast Times at Ridgemont High, or Night of the Comet, or all these, like, you know, movies that like all these movies that have like that takes place inside malls. Logan's Run, for example, the science fiction film, was filmed in a mall in Dallas. But it's like, you know, these spaces that, you know, we're supposed to, like, you know, understand like as kind of like these like margins of the discourse, the margins of the discipline are actually, you know, I grew up in Texas, so it's like, you know, they're always like, you know, I spent a lot of time in the Houston Galleria, for example, which is conceived as an interior urban space. You know, it's a way of just kind of like taking like the energies of the city and kind of like almost like submitting them to a centrifuge and kind of like focusing them in kind of like the enclosed area.
And I think so. It's like a model of like the city in a box within the city, and it's the same as the Holodome. We were talking about this last night. That it is kind of one version of Columbus. Like it tells a kind of bizarre story. Like when you're inside there, there's speech bubbles over busts of Christopher Columbus talking about Columbus, Indiana, that are like pretty fascinating. It was an interesting way to learn about Columbus for me. But that, you know, that version of Columbus is situated in a box in the city of Columbus. So it's kind of like a model of the city. It's the same way that the mall would be.
But and again, it's like more. It's like there are other ways to think about. I mean, we're kind of venturing into these, like, talking about malls almost exclusively, but it's important to rein it in, so to talk about mall, like the Holodome is a way to talk about malls and like its relationship to, you know, this kind of discrete architecture or this like kind of minor architecture. And like, let's not forget that, you know, things that we, you know, that we laugh at because they're kind of like the Holodome actually had very significant architectural import. The experimental community of tomorrow, or Epcot Center, for example, was part of it was a regional planning effort by Walt Disney. That was like, if you watch the films where he's basically preparing the presentations for Congress, where he's trying to get money from, you know, from the government to basically plan these things. It's like thinking about these kinds of like crazy kind of environments and stuff like that. But it's just kind of as a way to it's a way to create spaces for people. And the thing is, like, and no matter how whimsical and stuff, the impulse is always there to create a city. A city was always kind of, so it's a kind of utopian ideal. So always. So.
Yeah. Also, there's another kind of strain of. It's not a minor architecture, but it's a little bit not the high modern canonical stuff that you see in the books. But it's this like kind of late modern, but like Mannerist high modern. It's not really high tech, but it's something specific to, I think, like the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Here, there's like this whole body of work that some of the most radical stuff actually came a little bit later in the schools from Mount Healthy and Smith and Fodria.
So significantly, that was like a way to continue, you know, the dialogue or the conversation of some of the classics, the early folks, like the one we're sitting in now. You know, that comes, and then, you know, the IMP building here is, you know, built, and then what do you do after that? What do you do in the next decade, in the next decade? And it poses the question of, you know, today, how you continue, we've had this conversation all morning, but how you continue that legacy. Is it through acts of like civic or institutional building in the city. Probably not, but maybe through this exhibition to like another format. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the pavilion format. Maybe that's what it is, or maybe it consolidates into something larger. But I think the question is, it's really interesting to track back through those different eras, you know, and see how architects in the 70s were responding to architects in the 60s, and how, you know, it's less apparent now, but I think it was probably very apparent, you know, during the time.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's are there any other examples you can think of where these kind of contemporary architects are responding to this kind of context, like mid-century? I guess that's what kind of makes this project unique, is the...
That's Siri. No, you don't want to do Siri.
Yeah, I wonder if there's another example of these, because we kind of, I don't know, there's a, yeah, is there another example of contemporary architects responding to mid-century or late modern stuff like this?
I need to think about that, but I'll pass it out to you.
So we were talking about the church last night, and I don't know. I mean, I think the big takeaway is that you know, a lot of these, there's this concentration of projects that were commissioned, you know, years ago, and that's, you know, that intensity of construction is not occurring today. So how do you continue the dialogue and the conversation, not through acts of building, but other acts? And so I think that's the big question for Exhibit Columbus that they're addressing through this, you know, is can we continue the legacy, not through building, but through other means? So I think it's an interesting question for architecture.
Just to follow up on that, it's like think of it as an educational program, but just not for the sake of education, it's for the sake of ennobling, perhaps. It's like kind of ennobling the mission, or basically kind of like putting the, think of it almost like a hot potato, give it into the community. It's like, okay, now what are you going to do? It's like, what's to be done now? So almost like where the handoff is just it's just as important as the resolution, you know. So being able to create the situation where the dialogue can be sustained, I guess is the thing. Which is not exactly leaving it unresolved, but it's like kind of like, you know, admitting to the fact that some of these questions will not be dealt with until the next iteration of Exhibit Columbus, for example. So, yeah.
Well, you're going to be off the hook after this, so I just wanted to hear your kind of last thoughts on both of your last thoughts on what's going on in Columbus, what you think is underrepresented here, maybe, as far as architecture goes.
I'll let you go first.
Well, if we're doing concluding statements, I think the first concluding statement I have to make is it's Enrique's birthday. So cheers to Enrique for being here on his birthday. I don't know. I guess the intensity of the amount of pavilions that are here concentrated all in one, you know, walking radius, I think is inspiring. You know, it's inspiring to see so much work so close to each other. And I think that is something unique to Columbus that I don't get in too many other places when talking about build work, you know. I think that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So
just in terms of like other avenues to be discovered, perhaps in different future iterations of this event. the relationship, the relationship to the natural environment, for example, the correlation to the built environment and the natural environment here, and just not just the flooding, of course, but just like, in terms of like, what if more landscape architects were involved, for example, in Exhibit Columbus, and then having worked with landscape architects is always like it's a very kind of interesting mode. It's like when you go from this like kind of like thinking of these like hard kinds of things like materials and buildings to like plantings and kind of like things that's like accommodating for creating designs that are going to somewhat not withstand the ravages of time, but kind of accommodate the ravages of time, so to speak. Another one is also just to like, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but it's like kind of like understand the history of these buildings, just so the history of manufacturing in general, not fabrication, but manufacturing. So, which is a different thing. I know like there's like in this event we talk a lot about fabrication, but that's it. Understanding how different that is when thinking about the history of Cummins, for example, and also, as a historian of the 18th and 19th century, I keep thinking about railroads, right? It's like the importance of this part of the region to the development of railroad spurs that connected east to the west coast, the river traffic from New Orleans to St. Louis, for example, and also just like the federal interstate system as well. So what role does Columbus have to play in that? Because it's almost like it becomes like a way station, and it's like this. So Columbus and, for example, the old Army airfield north of here as well, which is an important stop in the history of Columbus, because that's where Robert, Indiana was stationed, before, at an earlier part of his career. So anyway, I can talk more about it, actually. Probably.
So you should probably get writing.
Yeah. Like writing, or?
I think you should go see some buildings. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.
It's really great. And happy birthday.
Thanks.
And John, thanks a lot too for finding these minor architectures. So thanks a lot. Next up is our Midwest Super Panel.